This episode is going to be a little different. Instead of me necessarily sharing how to do this, how to do that, I'm going to be talking about kind of my own journey of exploring different cultures and honestly just culture in general through folk dances and movement.
You're listening to That Music Podcast with Bryson, the curriculum designer and educational consultant behind That Music Teacher and the Elementary Music Summit. Each week, Bryson and his guests will dive into the reality of being an elementary music teacher and how music can truly be transformative in the lives of the students you serve. Show notes and resources mentioned in this episode can be found at thatmusicteacher.com.
Welcome back to That Music Podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about movement. I love doing movement in my classes. I think there are so many musical goals and standards and objectives and skills that we can explore through movement. But one thing that I love about it is that it really is such an easy jumping off point to get into a lot of different discussions. We can take it lots of different ways. But one of, for me at least, especially, going through my levels training, my Code levels training and going to conferences and learning things like that, one of the best ways to kind of dive into something that I've noticed is the power of movement. So folk dances, play parties, and things like that have really allowed me as a person to get a lot of exposure and to just culture in general. Because when we think about it, the reason that especially a lot of these folk dances exist is 100% because of culture. Dancing is a social thing in a lot of cases. It's, at celebrations, at parties. I mean, think about, we typically dance at weddings. And then there are, different cultures that they have these very specific dance traditions that I personally think is just so cool. We talk a lot about music tradition as music educators, which I guess makes a lot of sense. But there's this whole other side to it that's so incredibly interconnected of movement and dance. And that's what we're going to be talking a little bit about today. Because me as a person, I know that I've learned a lot about different cultures because of the dances that I learned maybe at a conference or through different things. Because I personally am one of those people that really like to dive in and learn more about something or see the context of things. So it's really cool to be able to see that, all right, hey, this is a song that's traditionally, or, a dance that's traditionally done at this specific festival or this time of year. And I think that's really cool as a person. But I think when we're able to use that as teachers, that is where the bar is just getting raised completely. Especially if we're using it that, kind of the homage of, allowing what happens in our classroom to serve as windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors in our classroom. I think really it's really easy for us to do that. And I say easy in a way of, probably for lack of a better word of saying, when we do it correctly, it can be very easy. Now, doing it correctly can be a little bit of we'll talk about that later, but right now, let's talk a little bit about how we can use movement and, folk dances and play parties to open up and start these discussions on just culture. First of all, if we're not having discussions about culture in our classrooms, I think that's a missed opportunity. And I know, I'm a white man who's saying this, so I want to first start off by saying that whenever we are able to celebrate other cultures through authentic ways, that's what we should be doing, especially if we have people that are willing to be culture bearers and share their information. Me personally, that is why I love being able to go to these different conferences where we have people that come from different backgrounds than me that are able to share part of their culture, and then in turn I'm able to share that back with my students. And I think it's also important that when we do that, we talk about it. We say, hey, I learned this dance at a conference from so-and-so. She's from this place, she loves being able to use this. She kind of told this story. And I think that's where we're able to, one, show that we are not the culture bearers if we're not, but also kind of just give, not necessarily credit, but just give homage to the fact that this was passed down to us. And we are just sharing it because we thought it was so cool. We thought it was important to pass on. Sometimes when we have these discussions, it can be a little bit a little bit nerve-wracking because we don't really know where it's going to go. And I think that's a good thing, but I also, the reality is in a modern teaching environment, there are sometimes things that happen out of these discussions for better and sometimes for worse. But I think that they're still important to have. So sometimes it's very, whenever I do a folk dance or something, I always set a very clear expectation that, hey, it doesn't matter what we're doing in this classroom, I expect you to be safe, responsible, and respectful. And, just because something is different from what you're used to, does that make it weird? No. Just because something isn't necessarily what you would like to listen to, does that make it bad? No. And just, again, having these constant discussions of whether it's about different cultures or not, that we're allowed to like different things, we're allowed to be different, we're allowed to have different opinions on things, but what we need to be is respectful of that. So that's always where I kind of start this, especially if there might be a recording involved that isn't typically what they would be used to hearing, just kind of because I want my students to be comfortable hearing things that aren't what they expect. And I think that sometimes we overcorrect when we have students that are reacting to something new. And they might be doing it just because they don't really know how to react, because not just the act of listening to this or doing this movement or whatever, not only is that new, but the act of hearing things that are different can be new, and we need to model that. So sometimes we overcorrect because we want to shut down all this stuff. And yes, there are certain things that we should shut down: disrespect, racism, anything like that. But sometimes students are just reacting because, hey, this isn't the music that they're used to. They don't know how to process it. So sometimes you can model that yourself, hey, when I first heard this, it kind of took me a little bit by surprise. But once I listened a little bit more, I was able to hear how da-da-da-da-da. And again, model that showing. Keep the respect there, but also model how they can be respectful, not just shutting down when they're not. Because sometimes that's where we can get students that will say, all right, I'm not even going to touch it, because if whenever I try to react to it, somehow it turns into this big thing. Be aware of where that line is, and be aware of how we can, when we should be modeling how to do something and when we need to be shutting down and getting involved. So with that conversation out of the way, I love using folk dances and play parties to talk about life. Because let's be honest, that's what culture is. Culture is the explanation and the celebrations of life within a culture. And I think that is something that we don't talk about enough, because sometimes we're so focused in the now. But when we think about folk dances, or just folk songs for a second, a lot of them are about very similar things: people dying and people getting married. Because if you were a child, especially, a couple hundred years ago, that, there's probably going to be a lot of people that are dying because medicine was different, or, there's probably going to be more celebration around marriage, or there's going to be celebration around marriage just like there is today, because that's a good thing. And the same thing with dances apply. You might have dances that are very specific to a certain occasion. You might have dances that are certain to a specific festival or religious occasion, or just, a time of the year. And that's where, when we use these correctly, when we use these authentically, we can start these conversations about how music is just woven into the lives of humans, and how music really is an innately human thing. It might be different. It might sound different. We might write it down different. We might not even write it down at all. But music itself is an innately human thing. And this is ways that we can start kind of weaving that into our curriculum very early on, just by showing that there is music out there in the world that is not the music that you listen to. Now, I've talked a few times about, how do we do right? And again, I'm going to be the first one to tell you that I'm a white man telling you this. So I'm kind of taking a lot of the information that I've learned in my own journey of learning how to do this, but also through conferences and trainings by other people who have shared their information and their understanding of it as well. The first thing is you're going to have to do your homework. There's nothing more awkward or disappointing than teaching an entire song about, or a folk dance or song or whatever, saying, oh, this is a Mexican folk dance. They use it for XYZ. It's from this part of Mexico, yada, yada, yada. And then finding out that none of that is true. or that is completely contrived, or hey, this was a song that somebody wrote for their classroom like 4 years ago. Like, this is not a thing. So making sure that you are doing your diligence on your research. So getting primary sources whenever you can. So again, that's where if you learn it from somebody, that can be a really good thing, as long as they're able to kind of show that they've done their homework as well. Or if you learn it from a book, what's the source of that book? Are they able to track it back? And just being aware that, hey, sometimes we might learn a song, or we might learn something that's just wrong. It might have been passed down forever and ever, and we just thought it was something different. I mean, hey, Kodai people, we've been doing a lot of that in our folk repertoire lately, haven't we? Of just learning new things. Again, it comes back to the thing of when you know better, do better. But I really think that when we're able to include folk dances and play parties and movement activities that are passed down from different cultures, that is such a really cool way to show how everything is connected in the human experience, right? Music is connected to dance, which is connected to theater, which is connected to culture, which is connected to history. Everything is interwoven and connected on all these different branches going out different ways, connecting to everything else. Especially in our modern school system, where we tend to get very focused on like this, rather than, hey, this is all the stuff. We get very compartmentalized. And I think that we need to model and show that the human experience is not that. That's kind of a construct that we've added, for better or for worse, to make schooling more organizational or more structured. But without getting too far off the tangent, again, I told you this episode was going to be a little bit different because it's something that I've really seen be very successful in my classroom. Especially, I have a large population of Spanish-speaking students in my classroom. So whenever I'm able to come back from a conference and share a new song or dance or activity, especially when it's a dance, they love being able to, or a dance that comes from a Spanish-speaking country. I see them light up. But my favorite part of that is that all of the students are lighting up. It's not disengaging to those that don't have that background knowledge or that background information or that previous connection. It's just extra engaging and extra humanizing and extra, community building for those students that do have that background that might not necessarily see that background represented in a lot of the rest of their life. So I guess my challenge for you is this: do some movement, do some folk dances, do some play parties. But when you do so, make sure that it's authentic. Make sure that you're using it in a way that isn't just a time filler. And make sure that you're ready for some conversations, because your students are curious. Your students are going to want to know what a pawpaw is if you're doing pawpaw patch. Your students are going to want to know why los machetes, they would typically use, machetes to do it. They're going to want to know these different things. So have some information, have some background on it, be ready, or at the very least, show that humility when someone asks you a question. Do not make up the answer if you don't know. Please don't. Go in and say, that is a really good question. I would love to figure that out. Let's see if we can find it out. Those are the conversations that model lifelong learning, that model interconnectedness in humans in general, and that model that we are part of a bigger system, not just teaching music just because we like music. So if you are not a member of that music teacher community, I highly recommend you join us this month. We are going to be having a masterclass with a guest speaker all about doing movement and folk dances in the music classroom, and it's not one you're going to want to miss. You can check out the information for that in the description of this episode. If you're listening in the future, hello future, all of the recordings from our previous masterclasses are uploaded into our growing curriculum library, our growing professional development library rather, inside that music teacher community. I want to leave it there for today, but in case nobody has told you lately, thank you so much for making a difference in the lives of the students that you teach.